Something in the air had already changed before anyone said a word. Not the kind of change you can measure. No drop in temperature, no shift in light, but a tightness that slid under the skin and stayed there, like breath held too long. Even the smallest sounds felt out of place. A boot scuffing the floor, paper dragged across wood, the faint click of a metal cap being turned between two fingers. Each noise landed and then died, swallowed by a silence that didn't feel natural. Men sat close together without leaning toward each other, shoulders stiff, hands kept busy with nothing. A pencil tapped once, then never again. Someone's knee bounced under the table until the leg stopped as if commanded. There were no jokes, no polite murmurs, only faces angled down, eyes lifted up as if everyone was waiting for a door to open that they didn't want to see open. I stood where I had been told to stand, near enough to be useful, far enough to be forgotten. That was the whole point of someone like me. You learn early how to exist in rooms that don't include you. You learn how to become quiet furniture. You learn to look attentive without looking curious. And you learn that when important men go silent together, it's because they are trying not to hear their own thoughts. The light in the room wasn't kind. It didn't soften anything. It made edges sharper. The line of a jaw held too tight. The crease of a sleeve that hadn't been smoothed. The dark half-moons under eyes that hadn't slept. Smoke hung in thin layers, not drifting, just suspended, as if the air itself had grown heavy enough to hold it. Every time someone breathed out, it lingered. The room didn't let anything go. No one met anyone else's gaze for long. They looked past each other, over shoulders, at the table, at the wall, anywhere but straight into another man's face. It wasn't courtesy, it was avoidance. Because if you looked too directly, you might see what the other man already knew. And once you saw it, you couldn't pretend you hadn't. There was a folder on the table that nobody touched. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. The weight of it had nothing to do with pages. It sat there like a small, neat threat. Clean corners. A closed spine. The kind of ordinary object you could mistake for nothing if you didn't understand what rooms like this were built for. That folder was waiting. So were we. A chair scraped. Slowly, carefully. Like the man moving, it was trying not to disturb the air. Another man cleared his throat and immediately regretted it. The sound was too human, too vulnerable. After that, even breathing seemed coordinated, shallow and controlled, as if anyone who inhaled too deeply might inhale doubt. I kept my eyes where they belonged, but I felt everything anyway. The tension traveled without words. It moved through posture, through pauses, through the way hands stayed flat on the table instead of reaching. It was the shape of a decision being carried toward a room like this, the way a storm pushes toward a coastline that can't move. Somewhere beyond the walls, life continued in ignorance. Engines, footsteps, distant voices. But in here, time narrowed. It became a thin corridor, and we were all standing in it, facing forward, pretending we weren't afraid of what was coming. Then the door handle turned, slow, deliberate, and every man in the room went still in the exact same instant, like they'd been waiting for this to begin and praying it wouldn't. By the time the door closed behind the last arrival, the room had settled into its shape. Not comfort, never that, but familiarity, the kind that comes from repetition, from knowing how many steps it took to cross the floor, from understanding which chair belonged to which man without looking at nameplates, from long days that blurred together until routine itself became a kind of authority. Only then did the place begin to reveal itself, slowly, the way truth does when it isn't announced. The walls were thick, built that way on purpose. They swallowed outside noise and returned it as a dull, distant pressure, like the memory of sound rather than sound itself. There were no windows at eye level. If there were any at all, they were placed high, meant to admit light without inviting distraction. The world outside was not supposed to be part of what happened in here. Maps covered one side of the room. Not decorative, not framed, pinned, folded, marked, and remarked. They had been altered so many times that the original paper showed through in places, pale and tired. Lines crossed lines, ink overlapped ink. Someone had tried to clean part of one map and only succeeded in smearing it. No one bothered to fix it. Accuracy mattered less than momentum now. The table bore its own history, grooves where hands had pressed too hard, rings from cups set down and forgotten. A faint burn mark near one corner, hastily sanded but never fully erased. This was not a place designed for comfort or ceremony. It existed to reduce human judgment into something flatter, something easier to sign off on. I had been assigned here weeks earlier, though weeks had stopped meaning much. Time bent in places like this. Days stretched, nights compressed. Sleep came when it could, not when it should. My role was simple enough: carry, observe, relay when asked. Speak only if spoken to. Be present without leaving a trace. That kind of position makes you invisible in useful ways. I learned the rhythms quickly, when men arrived early and pretended not to be, when they arrived late and dared anyone to mention it, who always took the same seat, who changed seats depending on who else was in the room. Hierarchy announced itself in silence more than speech. The higher a man stood, the less he needed to explain himself. Orders usually moved downward in fragments, pieces of sentences, half-formed thoughts that hardened as they traveled. By the time they reached someone like me, they were no longer questions or doubts. They were instructions, clean, final, detached from the voice that had first hesitated. That day followed the same pattern, until it didn't. The atmosphere had been tightening for days, not loudly, not dramatically, just a steady narrowing. Conversations shortened, papers arrived already stamped. Decisions that once took hours now took minutes. The men at the table spoke less but carried themselves as if the weight on their shoulders had increased. Something was coming. Everyone knew that much. No one said it directly. Saying it would have given it shape, and shape would have made it harder to avoid. I noticed it in the smallest things. How questions stopped being asked all the way to the end. How sentences trailed off, then were abandoned. How eyes flicked to the folder on the table and then away again, as if looking at it too long might pull it open. I had seen this before, not this moment exactly, but its shadow, the buildup, the quiet acceleration. It always came with the same signs, a sense that options were closing, not because they had been exhausted, but because patience had. The men above me believed in momentum, in keeping things moving. Stopping even briefly felt to them like weakness, and weakness in their minds invited consequences worse than any decision ever could. They spoke in careful tones now, measured, words chosen not for clarity but for distance. When responsibility was mentioned, it was never attached to a person, only to necessity, to timing, to circumstances that could not be helped. I stood behind them, slightly to the side, where I could hear everything and be heard by no one. From there, the room looked different, less unified, more fragile. I could see the pauses between remarks, the way one man waited for another to speak first, the subtle relief when someone else took ownership of a phrase that had been hovering, unwanted. No one asked my opinion. They never would. That wasn't my function. But listening without the obligation to decide has its own clarity. When you are not invested in defending a position, you hear what others are trying not to say. And what I heard, beneath the careful language, was fear. Not the sharp kind, the slow kind. The kind that convinces intelligent men that moving forward blindly is better than stopping to look down. At one point, a document was slid across the table. Not the folder. Something preliminary. Hands touched it briefly, then released it. A nod. Another nod. Agreement without enthusiasm. Consensus without conviction. I felt a tightness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with nerves. It was recognition. I had seen this pattern before, in other rooms, with other faces, different details, same structure. The moment when a decision becomes easier than reconsideration, when the cost of stopping feels higher than the cost of going on, even if no one can quite say why. No one looked at me, but I could feel the room narrowing again, drawing inward toward a point that had not yet been spoken aloud. The folder remained closed, and that, more than anything else, told me that whatever was coming had already gone too far to be undone. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, layer by layer. Like dust settling on a surface no one bothered to wipe clean. Voices dropped lower over the next hours, then days. Not whispers. Those would have drawn attention, but a restrained, deliberate quiet. Words were chosen carefully, then spoken as if they might be overheard by the walls themselves. I learned to read meaning not from what was said, but from what never quite made it into the room. Conversations stopped when certain men entered. They resumed only after a pause long enough to signal consent. Laughter vanished entirely. Even the brief forced kind that usually followed dry remarks disappeared, as though humor itself had been deemed inappropriate for the direction things were moving. I noticed how often eyes moved toward the door now, not in anticipation of relief, but interruption. Everyone seemed aware that the wrong arrival at the wrong moment could force a statement no one was ready to make. Timing mattered more than truth. The folder appeared more often. Sometimes it was brought out and placed on the table without being opened. Other times it was set just within reach of one man, then quietly pulled back by another. It moved like an object with its own intent, testing the room, reminding everyone it existed. I heard fragments when I wasn't meant to. A sentence cut short when footsteps approached. A phrase repeated with slightly different wording, as if refinement could remove its weight. A single word, necessary, used so often it began to lose meaning, becoming a kind of shield instead. Men leaned closer to one another now, but not in confidence, in caution. Heads tilted, voices angled downward. Each exchange felt like a negotiation with something unseen. No one challenged anything directly. They asked questions that weren't really questions. They offered suggestions that dissolved the moment someone else acknowledged them. I stayed still. Stillness made me forgettable. Forgettable made me useful. From where I stood, I could see hesitation spreading unevenly. Some men carried it openly. Tight jaws, restless hands, eyes fixed too long on the same point. Others hid it behind efficiency. They pushed papers forward quickly. They summarized when detail might have slowed things down. They spoke as if speed itself could outrun consequence. That was when I realized something they hadn't yet admitted to themselves. The discussion wasn't moving toward a decision. The decision was already there. What they were doing now, these meetings, these revisions, these careful phrases, wasn't deliberation. It was preparation. They were aligning themselves emotionally with something they had already accepted intellectually. Each hour spent in that room was not to decide whether it would happen, but to make it feel survivable once it did. I felt it in my body before I could put it into words. A sense of wrongness that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with trajectory, like watching a heavy object roll downhill and knowing no one was strong enough or willing enough to step in front of it. Once, late in the day, someone asked a question that came too close to the edge. It hung in the air longer than expected. No one answered immediately. The room tightened. Then another man spoke, not to answer, but to redirect. A related point, a safer angle. The dangerous question dissolved without ever being acknowledged. That was the moment I understood how this would end. Not in chaos, not in shouting, but in agreement that felt thin and brittle, like ice forming over dark water, solid enough to stand on, right up until it wasn't. I wanted to believe there was still room for pause, for reconsideration, for a voice, any voice, to slow things down. But every sign pointed the other way. Each silence reinforced the last. Each glance away became permission. I said nothing. There was nothing for me to say. Even if I had spoken, the sound would have landed in a room already trained to absorb doubt and give nothing back. The folder was opened briefly then, just enough for pages to shift, for a corner to lift and fall. No one leaned in to read closely. They didn't need to anymore. The shape of the outcome had become clear to me then. In that quiet, unmistakable way clarity sometimes arrives. The realization didn't come with fear. It came with weight. And it stayed. When the words finally came, they did not arrive with force. They were spoken evenly, calmly, as if they had been practiced enough times in the speaker's mind that they no longer carried edges. The voice did not rise. It did not demand attention. It didn't have to. The room was already listening. No one announced that a decision was being made. There was no preface, no clearing of the throat to mark significance. Just a continuation of the same restrained tone that had governed every conversation leading up to this moment. The sentence began like any other, and then, halfway through, it crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I remember the sound more than the content. Not the meaning of the words, but how they landed. Soft, controlled, final. They did not echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the room like dust, coating everything without resistance. The kind of statement that doesn't invite response because it isn't looking for one. For a brief instant, no one moved. It wasn't shock. It was alignment. Each man in that room needed a fraction of a second to adjust his posture, his expression, his internal position, so that what had just been said would not feel like a break, but a continuation of what had already been happening. One man nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. Another shifted his chair slightly, as if the angle he'd been sitting at was no longer appropriate. A third folded his hands together, then immediately unfolded them, unsure which gesture better matched the moment. The folder was pulled closer. It was opened fully now. Pages were turned with care, not urgency. The sound of paper moving felt louder than it should have. Someone traced a line with a finger, then stopped, as if even that small act carried too much responsibility. There was no discussion of alternatives. None were asked for, none were offered. I stood where I had always stood, close enough to hear the decision clearly, far enough to avoid being associated with it. The man who had spoken did not look around the room afterward. He looked down, not in doubt but in completion, as if the act of saying it had closed something inside him. Others followed his lead. Eyes dropped. Pens were picked up. Notes were made that did not record hesitation. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded. It held every unspoken objection, every deferred concern, every quiet calculation about responsibility and distance. It pressed in on the walls. It sat in the spaces between chairs. It rested on shoulders that did not shift under its weight. No one said my name. No one asked me to confirm anything. My presence had fulfilled its purpose simply by witnessing. I felt a strange detachment then. Not relief, not numbness, but a sense of being slightly out of alignment with time, as if I were already standing in the aftermath, looking back at this room from a place no one else could yet see. Someone asked a procedural question. It was answered immediately. Another asked when, not if. That answer came just as smoothly. Each response locked the decision further into place, like bolts tightened one after another. The moment passed without ceremony. There was no declaration that it was over, no acknowledgement that something irreversible had just occurred. The men simply moved forward, as though momentum itself had been granted authority. I did not speak. I did not look away. I listened to the last word of the order settle into the room, and understood, with absolute certainty, that nothing said after this point would change what had already begun. What followed did not resemble action. It resembled adjustment. Chairs were pushed back slightly. Papers were gathered and stacked with a care that felt almost excessive, as if neatness might impose control over what had just been released. Voices returned, but only barely. They moved in narrow channels now. Short confirmations, clipped acknowledgments, language stripped of anything that could be mistaken for emotion. I was given a task, a small one, something logistical, the kind of instruction that exists to keep people occupied while larger consequences begin to move on their own. I accepted it without comment. My hands knew what to do even as my mind lagged behind, still replaying the sound of the words that had changed everything. Outside the room, the corridors felt longer than before. The air was different, not heavier, emptier. Conversations I passed stopped abruptly, then resumed after I was gone, but with a different tone. Something had already begun to ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable. People sensed it before they understood it. That always came later. Messages were sent. Not hurried, not delayed, precisely on time. Each one stripped down to essentials, carrying no trace of the weight behind it. I watched men read them, nod once, and pass them on. No one asked questions, not because they had none, but because the moment for questions had quietly expired. There was confusion, but it moved silently. Small inconsistencies appeared first. Timelines that didn't quite align. Expectations that assumed more certainty than actually existed. I noticed them immediately. The way you notice a door left slightly open in a building that's supposed to be sealed. Others either didn't see them or chose not to. Pointing them out would have required stopping, and stopping had already been ruled out. I overheard a brief exchange near the end of the day. Two voices, low and careful. One asked if something had been confirmed. The other replied that it would be, not that it was. The distinction went unchallenged. By the next morning, the room from before was quiet again, reset to neutrality. The folder was gone. Its absence felt louder than its presence ever had. The maps were still on the walls, but they no longer felt provisional. They had hardened into assumption. I felt it then, the shift from decision to consequence. Not dramatic, not immediate, just a subtle closing of space. Fewer options, fewer exits. The sense that events were now moving on rails laid long ago, and that all the careful language, all the controlled tones, had done nothing to change their direction. Somewhere, far from where I stood, things were beginning to not line up the way they were supposed to. Not catastrophically. Not yet. Just enough that anyone paying close attention would feel it in their bones. I was paying close attention. I carried another message that afternoon. I delivered it exactly as instructed. When I handed it over, the man receiving it looked at me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Not with suspicion, with something closer to uncertainty. Then his expression reset, and he thanked me in a voice that sounded too steady. As I walked away, I understood that the fear I'd felt earlier had been replaced by something else. Confirmation. The kind that arrives quietly, without spectacle. The kind that tells you your earlier unease was not imagination, not pessimism, not doubt, but recognition. The decision had passed through the room. Now it was passing through people, and it was already doing exactly what I had known it would do. Time did what it always does after moments like that. It kept moving, indifferent to what it carried with it. I stayed where I was supposed to stay. I continued doing what I had been trained to do. The days arranged themselves into something that resembled normalcy, if you didn't look too closely. Papers moved, orders flowed, faces changed, but the structure remained. From the outside, nothing appeared broken, but memory has its own habits. Long after the room had been repurposed, after different men had sat in the same chairs and spoken different sentences with the same certainty, that moment returned to me in fragments. Never as a whole, always incomplete. A voice, stripped of its tone. The scrape of a chair. The weight of silence pressing inward after the last word was spoken. I never spoke about it, not because I was told not to, but because there was no language for it that wouldn't distort it. People want clarity when you speak. They want explanation, motive, meaning. What I witnessed resisted all of that. It was not confusion. It was not malice. It was something quieter, and therefore harder to confront. I learned that guilt doesn't always arrive with regret. Sometimes it arrives as repetition, as the mind returning to the same instant again and again, trying to locate the point where intervention might have been possible, even when you know it wasn't. I asked myself that question more times than I can count. Not what should I have done, but what exactly did I see that others didn't? The answer never changed. I hadn't seen more information. I hadn't possessed special insight. I had simply been unburdened by authority. Free, in that narrow sense, to feel the direction of things without needing to justify them. That freedom came at a cost. Years later, details blurred. Faces faded. Dates lost their edges. But the sensation remained intact. That tightening in the chest. That sense of standing slightly outside the moment, already aware of its future. It returned unexpectedly. In quiet rooms, in pauses between conversations, in the way certain silences still feel heavier than others. No one ever asked me about that day. If they had, I'm not sure what I would have said. That the decision sounded reasonable when it was spoken. That no one raised their voice. That everything unfolded with discipline and restraint. None of that would have explained what went wrong. What ended badly did not do so because of chaos. It ended badly because of calm, because of order, because of a shared willingness to move forward without asking the kind of questions that slow things down. Because everyone involved understood just enough to proceed, and not enough to stop. I remained an observer for the rest of my service. That role fit me better after that. Watching became easier. participation more distant. I learned how to keep my expression neutral even when recognition stirred beneath it. I learned how to carry knowledge without letting it surface. But some things surface anyway. Even now, there are moments when a sentence spoken too smoothly will pull me back into that room, when a pause feels rehearsed instead of thoughtful, when silence follows a decision too quickly, too neatly. In those moments, I don't see the outcome. I don't relive the aftermath. I hear the words as they were spoken. I feel how they landed. And I remember standing there, understanding, before anyone else admitted it to themselves, that what had just been set in motion would not correct itself, would not slow down, and would not forgive the certainty that launched it. That understanding never left me. It didn't make me wiser. It didn't make me braver. It simply taught me this. Some endings announce themselves long before they arrive. And sometimes the person who realizes it first is the one with the least power to do anything but remember.